Morgantown for me has always been like a place of community. Everyone is everyone's neighbor. And honestly, like if you don't know anybody there, it won't take 5 seconds before you already have a friend. Like it's that kind of community.
My mom and dad moved us here in 91, 92. It was a fabulous place to be raised. I love raising my kids there.
We were all living in one house. It was my mom and papa, and then my sister, my parents, and then my mom's siblings, and then Angie's kids were there as well.
Angie had a boyfriend in high school, and they actually went on to have 2 children. And then things did not work out between them, and they separated. Well, our parents were not exactly thrilled because both of us became young mothers. They basically were 100% supportive. Yep, we were very, very close.
Angie was the best sister. Me and her, we're only 2 years apart. With her, she was my best friend.
She was free-spirited. A rainy day, she came into the room, you would never thought it was raining.
Oh, Angie was a firecracker. She always had the loudest laugh. That was just infectious.
So me and Angie, we went and got food. And she said, I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell mom and dad. I was like, okay, lay it on me. What do we got? And she's like, I've met someone. I was like, well, okay, like, what's his name? Joey.
I remember her saying that he had come to her work and he was kind of like following her around the store, maybe found her attractive.
Angie was very into like the emo scene, dark clothes. She was like a rocker girl. Joey was very much that rocker type boy.
I remember it like when she brought him over. Mom was very on the defensive, very protective. And dad was like, well, let's play this out and see, prove to me that you're a decent person, prove to me that you're good enough to date my daughter kind of thing. I talked to Joey about that, and I went up to him and I was like, she really likes you. She really cares about you. Please be good to her. He said that he would.
I remember the first time that I met Joey. I was at my mom and papa's house and I was sitting in the living room, and that's when Angie walked in with Joey. I remember he leaned down to show me the tattoo he had on his shoulder, and it was a 666 tattoo. I remember his exact words to me were, I got this tattoo to show that even in good, there's always some evil.
Growing up in Morgantown, a small community, we were raised Christian. So when I seen him with all kinds of tattoos, I was like, okay, I don't know really how to feel about this.
Morgantown is very small, pretty tight-knit community. Everybody knows everybody, basically.
I think with Joey, it was outside of the norm of what you would expect to see in really anybody in our community. It kind of drew Angie in the sense of this was something different.
She seemed happy. It was a, new relationship, and things were really, really good. In 2012, Angie and Joey decided that they were going to get married.
I asked her, are you sure you want to do this? Does he make you happy? And she said, yeah, He does.
We did a little reception at my uncle's house, and everything went really well. I think in the beginning, she seemed happy. He treated her older two kids okay, and I think that we were happy that she was happy.
We were absolutely delighted. And nice to see, her and all the kids, just happy.
Angie decided she wanted to be a certified nursing assistant. She loved it. She loved it so much.
Her and I worked together at a long-term care and rehab facility. Angie not only, worked her full-time hours, but she worked overtime every single week. A lot of times we would go in together and we would actually work like doubles, which are 16-hour shifts.
My sister, was working almost every day. But later on in the relationship, we started seeing he would not work. He wouldn't work.
I remember he got a job one time at, I believe it was a UPS shipping facility. He worked there for maybe a few months and then he quit. And then his reason for quitting was that it was boring, and that was it.
What made me more mad than anything was that Joey would get mad when she took days off, when she didn't pick up a shift. He said it was lost money, money that she wasn't bringing in.
He liked being home. He liked, only doing those bare minimal things, and that Angie not only paid all the bills, but she got to where she was even giving him an allowance.
He told everybody that it was because he was a stay-at-home dad.
The house never got cleaned, and I remember that. I saw that. The house was a wreck. The kids were in dirty clothes. Laundry wasn't done. I wish I would have said something then. But Angie was doing everything that she could.
This man didn't even have a driver's license. If he needed to go anywhere or needed to be dropped off, he had to wake Angie up to do it.
The more I got to hang out over there, I guess Joey felt like he could be more comfortable with me around. Playing on video games, he would get violent, yell, throw the controller. And so for me, it was if he's acting like this, now, what's he doing behind closed doors? Angie, I was is he violent towards you? Does he yell at you? Does he hit you? All the time it was, no, he doesn't do anything like that. Joey wouldn't do that. Something in my gut was just I don't like him.
I started asking questions, and then Angie kind of lost contact with us.
My parents, they got concerned. Even her phone had been shut off, or she had gotten a new phone number, and so no one had a way of communicating with her.
Looking back, I guess that was the beginning of him just trying to gain control. Just trying to maybe distance Angie from mom and dad.
My whole family, if there's a reason for us to get together and celebrate something, we're gonna do it. We have 50 people that show up for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, and all of a sudden she was not showing up to those things.
He just kind of, slowly did it over time. It was, oh, I don't want to go. If you go, you're saying that it's okay that they don't like me, that they treat me differently. And then she would be guilted into staying home. Joe definitely had put a lot of strain on Angie with making her feel as if she had to choose between Joe or her family.
Me, mom, dad, everybody, was blocked. Like on Facebook, phone numbers, all that.
I remember mom crying about it. I remember dad crying about it.
I remember they were in the church parking lot and we had pulled up to park and we went to say hi. Joey, kind of shoved the kids in the car, shoved Angie, and they sped out of there. And I remember my mom and papa being like just so upset because they just wanted to see their daughter and their grandkids. And I was worried for my Aunt Angie. I was worried for my cousins.
That is what prompted her mom to reach out to the Child Protective Services.
That's whenever, I guess you'd say, everything started hitting the fan.
The house was a wreck. It was disgusting. It was awful. Like, honestly, if social services had seen the house like that, those kids would have been removed right then and there, no questions asked.
It really did escalate because my parents were so immersed in their grandkids' lives that someone to just say, no, you're not seeing your grandkids anymore, was just heartbreaking for my parents. They were the type of grandparents that always wanted their grandkids around them. They were happiest when they had all their grandkids around them.
I think for mom and dad, they feared for the safety of the kids, and I think they knew that maybe they could do something to help those babies.
I think her mom thought, if I can get the kids out of there, then Angie will follow. But that didn't happen. Joe was able to really spin that and make it to where her mom was now the enemy.
Her kids had practically been raised in and around my parents' home. All of a sudden, they were not allowed to be around any of our family.
Mom and dad not seeing the grandbabies hurt mom and dad more than anything else. I remember Angie reaching out to dad. She came to the house and she started crying and she hugged dad. And she's like, I'm so sorry for everything that I had done. It was heartwarming, I guess. But it felt good because it was a bridge. It may not have been a sturdy bridge, but it was a start.
She finally started to come back around, and Joey would also come around with her. They would typically visit for about an hour at a time. It would be an hour on the dot, and Joey was, okay, it's time to go. We need to go home now. It was like she was a prisoner, and this was her hour of recess. In 2013, Angie and Joey had their first kid together. That was Violet, a little girl. And then they had their second child, Archer.
I think that she really thought that maybe that was going to make him change his ways, that maybe things would turn around.
Shortly after she had Violet, I remember her telling me she couldn't be around any other men at all without Joe. He would, go through her phone, her text messages, her Facebook, and then that would turn into, a confrontation with him. He would push her, he would hold her up against the wall. When he got something in his head and wanted to fight about something, there was no getting away. She had tried to leave before, and he would tell her that if she didn't come back or if she didn't talk to him, that he would kill himself, that it would be her fault.
She did leave Joey for a very short amount of time. She moved in with my mom and papa and all of us with her kids. That was when she started to explain, like, Joey is abusive. He refused to get a job, and that when she would get paid, he would take control of her paychecks and her bank accounts and basically just leave Angie with just enough money for the bills. We were all just kind of like, leave him. Like, you cannot put yourself through this. You can't put your kids through this. Like, you have to get out of this relationship. And she would be like, I'm going to. And then she ended up going back with him.
It seemed like it was just a back and forth. And it became almost exhausting, where it was like they'd be okay for a couple of months. There'd be a fight. She'd leave. She'd stay at mom and dad's for a few days. They'd make up. It was a cycle. It was a cycle.
Every time she would run away from him, she would run to my parents. And so there was always just that fear that, well, they're going to be caught up in the middle of this.
Joey would send threats all the time, telling her, like, I'm going to put a bullet in your brain, your mom's brain, and your dad's brain if you ever leave me.
Joey came to the point where he was being more aggressive, being more violent, and Angie, she knew she couldn't do anything if she was dead. She couldn't protect her babies if she was gone.
So Angie had called me on Facebook. I messaged her as soon as I had woken up. And I was like, hey, what did you call for? And then she said protection. Joe had me pinned in the bathroom. It got so bad.
That was the straw that broke the camel's back. This was when she said, I've got to get out of here. I've got to do something to get out of this.
I knew that he was going to do something. I knew he was going to take matters in his own hands, and I was scared for him.
We are all at my cousin Renee's house, and we've got, a fire going, and we're roasting marshmallows. I see my mom answering her phone, and I said, what's going on? She said, don't say anything. Angie left Joey. And again, in my mind, I'm just like, oh, here we go again, for the umpteenth time.
I sat there and I remember saying, I was like, I won't believe it until the divorce papers are signed. I told them that. I was like, I won't hold my breath.
She was different this time, and she was done. And it was very evident that she was done.
I asked, I was like, well, how's he taking it? And she was like, oh, he won't stop blowing up my phone. Like, I have to literally, put him on, do not disturb. And I'm like, really? Like, that much? And I was like, so now that he realizes what he's done and what a piece of trash he is, now he wants to come running back. And Angie's just like, he's got nowhere to run to. She was like, I'm done with him. I loved hearing that. That was like a weight off my shoulder.
Those first couple of months, I was skeptical, and I was thinking, okay, this probably isn't gonna last long, but I'll just enjoy it while it is, Then, it kind of got to that point where it had been the longest she was away, and I could tell how happy she was.
It's like 7 a.m. I'm sitting there in bed and I just, hear, a knock at my door. Then the door just opens and like she's standing there, hands on her hips. She goes, "New me. The world is my oyster." She's like, and I am finally taking a hold of my life.
We were thrilled. I mean, the whole family, it was basically like a party. I mean, we were so happy that she had left him.
Angie eventually met somebody new, and when I say that he was a complete 180 from Joey, I'm happy to say that he was. Like, she didn't have a bad word to say about him.
Wes, I mean, he loved her so much. He was just smitten with her. He treated her nice. He wasn't pushing her out the door saying, "It's time to go, it's time to leave." He just had a great relationship with all of us. Christmas was really great. We had everybody there. And it was probably one of the most stress-free Christmases that we had, especially with Angie. We knew she was done with Joey. We knew that this chapter was kind of closing, and we were just so happy for her, happy for her kids, and it was just really great. I think she finally opened her eyes to, what he's doing is wrong. It's always been wrong. I can get out of this situation and be okay. And I think that's when she finally decided to put in the divorce paperwork.
When she finally decided to divorce him, he wouldn't sign the papers. But I know for a fact that she did. She had a lawyer. She had everything. She even sat there, got a new phone number, got a new bank account, everything to separate from him.
His state of mind at that point when the divorce papers were coming was not good. He was angry. He was just constantly texting my sister, calling my sister, harassing my sister.
When she wasn't answering, he was calling her oldest daughter. He would call her mom, and then he was calling her dad. I mean, they weren't even able to use their phones because he was just constantly calling.
He was losing control at that point, I think, and that's what started to scare him.
Joey started to tell Angie that he was depressed and that he wanted to kill himself, and started saying some very disturbing things.
He threatened to drink bleach. He also made the comment that he was going to do it whenever he had the kids.
She told him she doesn't feel comfortable leaving the kids with him by himself because she was worried that he might actually kill himself in front of them, and she didn't want her kids to see that. And so she told him, I need you to get help. I'm gonna keep the kids away for a little bit. I think that was when he finally went full psycho.
He did threaten her life. He said, if I can't have you, no one can. He threatened mom and dad. One point he said, if there was a real life purge, he was I'd go to your mom and dad's house and kill them.
Her lawyer did suggest that she gets a emergency protective order against Joe. Her and her lawyer had decided it was best to have no contact, no telling Joe where the kids were, of what they were, what they were doing. it was basically just gonna go cold turkey.
Myself, my parents, we all said, we're scared for you. We're scared for you, Angie. I'm scared of what he's gonna do. What if he shows up?
This is one of the texts that Joe had sent. Okay, I'll give it to the end of the day. Then, like I said 2 days ago, I tried to play nice, tried to leave it be, but now you are not replying and not answering, so I will be handling things accordingly. Reading this, I don't think that she was thinking that this meant that he was going to show up with a gun to her home, but now we know that that's exactly what he meant.
Where's your emergency?
Oh my God, my son! He just... Oh God, you gotta get someone over here!
Ma'am, what is your address? Where's your emergency?
Oh my God, my son! He just... Oh God, you gotta get someone over here! I just brought my son here to pick up the kids. Why would you do something like this? Jesus Christ. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Ma'am, I can't understand you. Now, is it your son that was shot or her?
My cousin is at home. Her husband is on fire and rescue, so he has a police scanner, and it came across that there was a male not breathing on Lonnie Snodgrass Road. They even gave the exact address.
I was in my office when I got a message from my cousin. I got told that an ambulance is heading to my house.
My dad had COPD, he was 79, he had health issues. I actually thought that it was something with my dad.
I was working at the hospital, and my brother Jonathan calls. He sounded troubled, and he was like, "Tony, I think something's going on with Mom and Dad. Can you go check on them? Can you go and see them?" And I was like, "Okay, yeah."
I reached my niece, and she said, Joey showed up with a gun. She said, Mama told me to grab the baby and go to the closet and lock the door. I'm calling my mom, and I'm calling my mom. And I'm calling my mom, and she doesn't answer.
I was at work that day when I got the call from the Kentucky State Police that we'd had a homicide. When I got to the home and made entry into the home, obviously it was unlike any crime scene I'd ever been to before.
The current time is 11:10 at the scene of a shooting. Be doing a walk through the residence.
As you breach the door threshold, Miss Carey was located prone on her back. She had substantial wounds evident of gunfire. A few further feet inside the residence was Miss McGranahan. To the area on the wall just above her head was a blood pattern impact that indicated that she had been shot at close range. Located on the couch of that residence were multiple casings, indicating that Joseph Carey had entered the threshold of that door prior to firing on Lupe McGranahan.
We're currently in the living room area, transitioning into the dining room, kitchen, magazine floor, multiple shell casings.
As you made your way in through the residence, there was various casings scattered across the living room and the dining room floor, kind of indicating the path that Joseph Carey would have taken as he had entered the residence.
This is the laundry room area. Additional individuals deceased.
Chuck actually was located inside the utility room.
It appears that the incident was contained to the interior of the residence and the front driveway.
You know, the scene itself just looked like a nightmare and a normal life of people that had been interrupted by, just a horrific event.
They already had a state trooper that was blocking the road. And so I pulled in.
Get there, I see some ambulances, and I keep thinking that like my mom or dad are gonna come out of this ambulance.
A first aid responder, she just looks at me and she's like, starts shaking her head and she's like, I'm so sorry. She told me that Joseph Carey showed up with a gun and shot and killed my sister, my mom, and my dad.
My brother comes to me and he says, they're all gone. And I said, what do you mean? I'm like, what do you mean they're all gone? And he said, Joey showed up and they're all gone. I didn't really know what to do at that point.
We remember seeing Joey get taken in a police car. I remember that. I'll never forget I locked eyes with him too. And when I looked at him, it wasn't human. It was evil.
The police already had him in custody, and he was transported from the scene to a state police post where they conducted a full interview.
We now needed to determine what would cause Joseph Carey to essentially execute all three individuals of his very close and immediate family.
I wasn't there. I didn't get to speak to you the first time. So if you could just walk me through your day, kind of let me know what happened and what your thought process was.
I went down to go speak to Angela, that was the mother of my kids, my wife. She came to the door with the door closed and was like, you need to leave. I said, can I just see the kids? That's all I want. And she said, you can talk to them through the door.
Mr. Carey, he had stated that he'd gone to the residence to get the children. I believe they were in the process of getting a divorce, and that he was trying to see the children.
And then that's when Loopy, Angela's mother, told Chuck to get the shotgun because I was staying too long. And that's when everything kind of went chaotic. She said, go get the shotgun. And I seen him passing through to the actual laundry room where I knew they kept the shotgun.
I think Mr. Carey wanted to convey to us that he had made those actions because he had been forced to make those actions.
The bullet thing that you're saying escalated the situation today was Loopy telling Chuck to go get the shotgun.
Yes. I was trying to save myself and the kids. And what went through my mind was just not letting him get a shotgun where he could do something. I don't even know how in my mind my solution was better. I should have ran or something.
Has Chuck ever pulled a shotgun on you before?
No.
Carey stated multiple times that his primary concern with Chuck is that he was going to retrieve specifically a shotgun in the house that he knew or suspected to be located in the utility room of the residence. Chuck did enter that utility room. There was a shotgun present in that utility room. However, it wasn't loaded.
I mean, can't tell you any more than what I've already told you, really. I just said get the shotgun. I panicked. I did. My anxiety kills me most of the time, and when I heard that, my heart rate went, whoop. I followed him. I just boom, 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 right, you can boom, 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 right, and then boom, boom, boom.
I'll interject this. I'm willing to play the buy your I panic story. I'll buy it. She had no firearm. She didn't accost you. She didn't assault you. She was in no way, shape, or form even arguably a threat.
Yeah.
She made no motion to a firearm.
No.
And you shot her.
Yes.
I think it's very important to remember that Angie McGranahan and Lupe McGranahan were found in very close proximity to one another, neither one of them having a gun on them, and that he had no right, Joseph Carey, to take their lives or to come in that home at all, even if he thought someone was going to get a gun.
So I've been listening to what you're telling me, okay? And some of the stuff's not adding up, okay? Okay. I'll tell you right now, I'm guilty of what I did. I cannot sit there and around and say I didn't hurt him or kill him. Well, I mean, we know that. What we're trying to understand is why. I'm telling you it was panic, but I ain't gonna lie to you, there's probably more to it than that. But I honestly jumped when I heard the shotgun thing. That was just after the perceived threat. Well, you was after one of three. Well, I understand that, but I'm saying that was my main goal, was to stop him. But what I'm getting at is Lupe was this way, he was this way. I get you. Your wife was here, he was this way. I get you.
I think he was very much aware of the decisions that he was making while he was present. I think he was aggravated with the custody agreement, and possibly emotions were slightly elevated upon hearing that his kids would potentially be taken from him.
After I shot Chuck, I walked back by Angie, and that's when I heard the Google noise. That was bothering me a lot. And I think, I can't tell you for sure, but I do think I did shoot again to get it to stop.
He was charged with 2 counts murder, 1 count murder, domestic violence, and I believe 3 counts of wanton endangerment. The Commonwealth of Kentucky is a death penalty state, and we knew most likely, just given the numbers of deceased individuals on scene, that would most definitely be something pursued by the Commonwealth's office.
When the suggestion of death penalty came up for Joey, I was in full support of it. The sooner he's dead, the better. I'm not gonna lie, the plea deal turned my stomach. After the evil you committed, you somehow still think that you're worthy of a plea. It was only after Blake explained that with a plea deal, it's done, it's over, there was no appealing. It was life in prison without the possibility of parole.
In looking at intent in a case like this, of what Mr. Carey's intent might have been, I believe he went to that residence to kill Angie McGranahan. I believe that Lupe and Chuck's deaths were just a result of them being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Joseph Carey shot Angie simply because she made it very clear that he was not going to have access to the children.
It was obvious that this was really just a cold-blooded, brutal murder of 3 people, 3 lives taken away from a family. That just really added another level to me of evil.
He was a monster. And they were 3 beautiful souls who were loved and just missed every single day. And every day is hard without them, even now.
They were definitely a safety net for me. You know, I felt like I was a tightrope walker, you know, and if I did fall, like, they were there.
My sister lived for her kids and ultimately died for her kids. And there's no greater sacrifice, you know.
I can't sum up one thing I miss about Angie. I miss my best friend. I miss my storyteller, my secret keeper, my confidant. 'Cause she was that and more. And not a day goes by that I don't think about them.
Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The kind of city that looks ordinary on the surface, where cold winds roll in from Lake Michigan and life moves with a quiet, almost predictable rhythm. But beneath that calm exterior, something in the late 1970s and 1980s would begin to fracture that sense of safety in ways no one could fully understand at the time. This is not just a story about a killer. It is a story about missed chances, ignored warnings, and the unsettling idea that darkness does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it sits quietly in a room, smiles politely, and blends into the background of everyday life. In 1991, when police finally stepped inside a small, unremarkable apartment in Milwaukee, they were not prepared for what they would find. The air itself seemed wrong, heavy with a smell that clung to the walls and refused to leave. What they uncovered would force the city, and eventually the world, to confront a nightmare that had been unfolding in plain sight. But before that door opened, before the headlines and the courtroom and the questions that would echo for decades, there was a boy. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 in Wisconsin. To neighbors, he appeared like any other child in a suburban setting that prized normalcy above all else. Yet even in childhood, there were signs that something inside him did not align with the world around him. He was quiet, withdrawn, often disappearing into his own thoughts. While other children formed friendships and chased attention, Dahmer seemed more interested in what was silent, still, and lifeless. His fascination with dead animals was one of the earliest hints that something deeper was forming beneath the surface. To adults around him, it may have looked like harmless curiosity at first, a strange phase that children sometimes grow out of. But for Dahmer, it was not a phase. It was the beginning of an internal world that would grow increasingly detached from empathy. Home life did not provide a stabilizing force. His parents' relationship was strained, filled with tension and emotional distance. Arguments were not uncommon, and the atmosphere inside the household often felt unstable. In that environment, Dahmer learned to retreat further inward, building a mental space where he did not have to explain himself to anyone. By the time he reached adolescence, that inner world had become more complex, more secretive, and more troubling. He collected remains of animals he found near his home. He conducted private experiments on them, not out of scientific curiosity, but out of a desire to understand control over something that could no longer resist him. These were not acts that anyone around him fully recognized as warning signs. They were dismissed, overlooked, or misunderstood. At school, he was not the kind of student who stood out. He did not cause trouble in obvious ways. Instead, he blended into the background, often appearing detached from conversations happening around him. Teachers might have described him as distracted or isolated, but not dangerous. That word would not have been used. Not yet. As he approached graduation, there were moments where his behavior became more erratic. Alcohol entered his life early, and with it came a loosening of whatever internal restraint had been holding his darker impulses in check. Still, nothing about him suggested to those around him that he would become one of the most infamous killers in American history. And yet, looking back, there is a haunting quality to those early years. A sense that something was building slowly, like pressure beneath cracked ice. In 1978, shortly after finishing high school, Dahmer committed his first known murder. It did not happen in a place of shadows or secrecy designed for crime. It happened in the open world, where chance encounters still feel ordinary until they are not. A man hitchhiking accepted a ride from a young stranger. It was a decision that would end his life and mark the beginning of something far larger and far darker than anyone could have predicted. After that moment, there was silence. Not peace, but silence. A pause that would last years. To the outside world, Dahmer drifted. He enlisted briefly in the military, struggled with alcohol, and seemed to fade into the background of his own life. But inside him, whatever had awakened did not disappear. It waited. When the killings resumed years later, they would not come as isolated incidents. They would form a pattern, a method, a rhythm that investigators would only fully understand in hindsight. Milwaukee would become the center of that pattern, a place where strangers disappeared into an apartment that looked no different from any other. But at this point in the story, none of that has happened yet. There are no crime scene photographs. No police reports. No courtroom testimony. Only the early shaping of a man, who would eventually force an entire nation to reconsider how evil can exist in plain sight. And somewhere in Milwaukee, life continues as usual. Lights turn on in apartment windows. People return home from work. Doors lock, then unlock again. Nothing seems unusual. Nothing seems wrong. Not yet. Milwaukee in the late 1970s and 1980s was not a city that expected to become synonymous with horror. It was a place defined by routine and repetition, where factory shifts dictated daily life, where neighborhoods were built around quiet streets and familiar faces, and where people generally believed danger belonged somewhere else, in distant headlines or faraway cities with names that felt disconnected from their own reality. On the surface, everything looked stable. Families went to work, came home, and repeated the cycle. Bars filled up on weekends with the same groups of regulars. Apartment buildings held long-term tenants who rarely changed. There was comfort in that predictability, but also a kind of blindness that came with it. When a place feels stable for too long, it begins to assume it is safe by default. It was into this environment that Jeffrey Dahmer eventually returned after a turbulent period of drifting, alcohol abuse, and failed attempts at structure. After his brief time in the military and the early signs of deepening isolation, he found himself back in Milwaukee, a city that did not ask many questions, and did not look too closely at the people living quietly on its margins. Dahmer did not stand out in this environment. In fact, his invisibility was part of what made him effective later. He lived in a modest apartment complex, the kind of place where neighbors might nod in passing, but rarely engage in conversation. People described him as reserved, sometimes awkward, often quiet to the point of being forgettable. He worked simple jobs, including shifts in a chocolate factory, where repetition and isolation suited him more than social interaction ever could. To those around him, he was not a mystery. He was simply absent in a social sense. He did not create trouble. He did not draw attention. And in a city full of people focused on their own struggles, that was enough for him to fade into the background completely. But beneath that surface, something had begun to reorganize itself. Whatever impulses had appeared earlier in his life were no longer dormant. They were becoming structured, deliberate, and increasingly detached from any recognizable form of empathy or restraint. The long pause between his first known murder and what would come later was not emptiness. It was incubation. Milwaukee itself played an unintentional role in this unfolding pattern. The city had spaces where people could disappear socially without actually leaving. Bars where strangers met without exchanging real names. Bus stations where travelers passed through without being remembered. Streets where late-night movement was common enough that no single figure drew attention. For someone like Dahmer, who relied on anonymity, this environment provided something essential: opportunity without scrutiny. In the early 1980s, the city also experienced shifts that made social fragmentation more visible. Economic pressures affected working-class communities. Certain neighborhoods became more transient. People moved more frequently, and connections between residents weakened. It was not chaos, but it was loosened structure, and loosened structure often creates gaps that go unnoticed until something falls through them. Dahmer existed in those gaps. His life during this period appeared externally uneventful. He maintained routines that made him seem stable enough not to raise concern. He went to work, returned home, and spent long hours alone. But isolation for Dahmer was not simply loneliness. It became a controlled environment where his thoughts could develop without interruption. There were no external corrections, no social frictions strong enough to disrupt what was forming inside him. Alcohol played a significant role in this phase of his life. It did not create his impulses, but it removed the remaining barriers that kept them from action. In moments of intoxication, judgment weakened, time blurred, and restraint became less consistent. What might have remained fantasy in another context began to move toward execution in his. Still, nothing about him at this stage would have clearly marked him as dangerous to casual observers. That is one of the unsettling aspects of this case. There was no obvious transformation, no visible collapse that alerted those around him. Instead, there was continuity. He remained the same quiet man in the same apartment, with the same habits and the same lack of social presence. And yet, in 1987, something shifted decisively. The pattern of his life changed from passive isolation to active pursuit. He began seeking out specific kinds of encounters in specific locations. Bars in Milwaukee's nightlife district became frequent environments for him. These were places filled with noise, dim lighting, and people looking for temporary connection. In that setting, Dahmer was not remarkable. He could blend in easily, observe without being noticed, and engage without drawing suspicion. He learned how to present himself in a way that reduced resistance. His speech was calm, his demeanor unthreatening. There was nothing in his outward appearance that suggested urgency or violence. This contrast between perception and reality became one of the most critical elements of his ability to operate undetected for as long as he did. The city, meanwhile, did not register a pattern. Individual disappearances were treated as isolated incidents, each explained by its own circumstances. People moved away, lost contact, changed lifestyles, or simply drifted out of sight. Without a centralized connection between cases, nothing forced the system to recognize a larger structure forming underneath. Dahmer's apartment became the final point of convergence for many of these disconnected paths. From the outside, it remained unremarkable. The building itself was ordinary, the kind of place where maintenance issues were more common than curiosity about neighbors. But inside that unit, a private world developed that was completely separated from public understanding. The conditions that allowed this to continue were not solely about one individual. They were also about the absence of interruption. There were moments where people came close to noticing something wrong, moments where intervention might have occurred earlier. But those moments passed without escalation. Doubts were not pursued. Concerns were not fully investigated. And in those gaps, the pattern continued to grow. Milwaukee at night remained unchanged in its rhythm. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement after rain. Cars passed through intersections with steady timing. Life continued in its ordinary cadence, unaware that beneath it, a hidden trajectory was forming that would eventually break through into public consciousness in the most violent and irreversible way. At this stage of the story, nothing has yet reached its breaking point. There are no headlines, no crime scene investigators, no national attention. There is only the quiet buildup of conditions that, when viewed in hindsight, appear almost unbearably clear. A city going about its life. A man moving through its spaces unnoticed. And a pattern forming slowly enough that no one realizes it is already in motion. Milwaukee, in the years following Jeffrey Dahmer's return, was a city that continued to live inside its own rhythm, unaware that a parallel story was unfolding in the spaces between ordinary routines. It was a place where people still trusted familiarity, where a neighbor's face in the hallway meant safety by default, and where the idea of hidden danger was more abstract than real. That sense of everyday normalcy would become one of the most important conditions that allowed what happened next to remain invisible for so long. To understand the victims in this case is to understand how that normal world intersected with someone who had learned to exploit it. These were not people who disappeared in isolation from life. They were part of it. They worked, they laughed with friends, they called family members, and they moved through the same streets and neighborhoods as everyone else. Their absence would later create a void that was deeply personal for those who knew them, even if the larger city initially failed to connect the pattern. Most of Dahmer's victims were young men, many in their late teens or early 20s, navigating a world of uncertainty, independence, and search for identity. Some were students, some were workers, some were simply passing through Milwaukee for a short time. What they shared was not a single background, but a vulnerability that existed in different forms: economic instability, social isolation, or the simple openness of trusting a stranger in a moment of casual encounter. In the late-night spaces of Milwaukee's bar scene, especially in areas frequented by marginalized communities, Dahmer found environments where social boundaries were looser and where people often came together briefly before separating again. These were places filled with noise and movement, where conversations were short-lived and attention was divided. In such settings, he was able to approach individuals without immediately standing out. To those he encountered, he did not appear threatening. There was no immediate signal of danger in his posture or expression. He spoke in a calm, measured way, often presenting himself as someone who was simply looking for company or conversation. In a world where strangers regularly met and parted without consequence, this was not unusual behavior. That normalcy was exactly what made it effective. The victims who chose to leave with him did so in moments that, from the outside, would have looked ordinary. A conversation at a bar. A shared drink. A decision made in the fluid uncertainty of social interaction at night. Nothing about those moments would have suggested the irreversible direction they were about to take. When they entered his apartment, they crossed a threshold that was invisible to them but absolute in its consequence. Inside, the environment was controlled entirely by Dahmer. There were no witnesses, no interruptions, no external checks on what would follow. The apartment, outwardly just another unit in a typical Milwaukee building, became the center of a closed world where the normal rules of interaction no longer applied. The violence that occurred within that space was not random in his mind. It followed a disturbing internal logic shaped by obsession, control, and detachment from empathy. Dahmer later described a desire not simply to kill, but to maintain possession, to preserve presence in a way that defied natural absence. This idea of control extended beyond death in ways that reflected a deeply distorted psychological framework, one that investigators and psychologists would later struggle to fully categorize. For the victims, however, there was no psychological theory in motion, no clinical explanation unfolding in real time. There was confusion, fear, and an abrupt shift from ordinary human interaction into something incomprehensible and final. The gap between their expectation and their reality was absolute. Outside that apartment, life in Milwaukee continued unchanged. Lights turned off in neighboring buildings at night. People walked past the same entrances and stairwells without awareness of what was occurring behind closed doors. The city did not register these events as connected because, at the time, there was no visible thread linking them. Each disappearance was an isolated absence, a single missing person case without immediate relation to the next. Families, however, experienced a different reality. For them, the absence was not abstract. It was a phone that stopped ringing, a message that went unanswered, a routine that suddenly broke without explanation. Some waited for returns that never came. Others searched, contacted authorities, or reached out through informal networks of friends and community members. In many cases, the lack of immediate answers created a slow, painful uncertainty that lingered far longer than the events themselves. Law enforcement responses varied depending on circumstances, and in several instances, early warnings or reports did not immediately lead to deeper investigation. There were moments when individuals who had narrowly escaped contact with Dahmer attempted to report their experiences, but their accounts were not always given the urgency they required. These missed opportunities would later become central to understanding how the pattern remained undetected for so long. What is most striking in this phase of the story is not just the actions of one individual, but the way ordinary systems struggled to connect fragmented information. Without a clear pattern, there was no immediate reason to see a series of unrelated missing persons as part of a single trajectory. The structure of the city's investigative response was designed to address individual cases, not hidden networks of behavior that did not yet appear connected. Inside Dahmer's private world, however, there was continuity. His actions followed a repetition that, over time, formed its own internal structure. What began as isolated incidents became part of a routine that existed parallel to normal life. He continued to maintain an outward appearance of stability. He went to work, interacted minimally with neighbors, and sustained the illusion of ordinariness that allowed him to remain outside suspicion. This dual existence created a gap that widened with each passing year. On one side, families were searching for answers. On the other, a man was moving through the same physical environment without detection, his private actions completely separated from public awareness. The distance between those two realities was not physical. It was perceptual. Milwaukee itself, in this period, did not change in a way that reflected what was happening beneath its surface. The streets remained the same. The buildings did not shift. Daily life continued with its familiar patterns. That stability, however, masked the fact that something deeply abnormal was operating within its boundaries. At this point in the timeline, there is still no final exposure, no discovery that brings everything into focus. There is only accumulation. Each victim, each disappearance, each unanswered question adds another layer to a structure that no one yet sees in full. The tragedy of this phase is not only what is happening, but what is not yet understood. Because somewhere in Milwaukee, behind an ordinary door in an ordinary building, the pattern is growing. And the world outside continues to move past it without knowing it is there. By the late 1980s, Milwaukee had become a landscape of repeating nights for Jeffrey Dahmer, a rhythm of dim streets, familiar bars, and long stretches of silence inside his apartment where time seemed to fold into itself. What had once been scattered impulses in earlier years had now taken on a structured pattern, not in the sense of chaos, but in the eerie discipline of repetition. He moved through the city like someone following a private map that only he could see, one drawn not on geography, but on opportunity and absence. Each night carried the possibility of encounter, and each encounter carried the possibility of control, or so it existed in his internal logic. The city outside remained unchanged, indifferent, continuing its cycles of work and rest, unaware that certain nights were no longer ordinary for the man living among them in his presence, and awareness fades slowly now. One evening in Milwaukee, a young man stepped into the flow of city nightlife, without any sense that his path had already begun to intersect with something unseen and deeply distorted. He had the ordinary intentions of someone looking to pass time, to meet people, to feel the temporary warmth of conversation in a place filled with music and low conversation. The bar was dim, filled with shifting shadows and the glow of neon signs that blurred the edges of faces and made strangers feel briefly familiar. It was the kind of environment where names were exchanged casually, where trust was assumed in small increments rather than earned. In that space, Jeffrey Dahmer was just another presence among many, sitting quietly, observing rather than participating loudly, blending into the background in a way that never suggested danger. The meeting between them began like any other ordinary night in the city. The conversation that followed was unremarkable on the surface, shaped by the casual rhythm of nightlife where strangers often speak without expectation of permanence. Words were exchanged in fragments, small observations about the night, the music, the atmosphere, and the shared experience of being present in the same space at the same time. Dahmer's tone remained calm, measured, almost hesitant at moments, giving the impression of someone who was socially awkward rather than someone with hidden intent. This perception was crucial, because it lowered the natural defenses that might have otherwise formed. The young man, like many others before him, interpreted this behavior as harmless, even slightly lonely, something that invited patience rather than caution. In environments like this, danger rarely announces itself directly. Instead, it blends into the familiar patterns of human interaction, making it difficult to distinguish between genuine connection and calculated performance designed to create trust itself. As the night progressed, the interaction shifted from casual conversation to a growing sense of familiarity neither of them named. Dahmer listened more than he spoke, allowing silences to stretch just long enough to feel natural rather than uncomfortable. He asked simple questions, careful not to appear intrusive, maintaining an image of quiet isolation and harmlessness. The young man responded with ease, reading the attention as companionship rather than calculation. Drinks were shared, and time became less structured, the boundaries of the evening slowly blurring. In spaces shaped by alcohol and dim lighting, decisions often form less through logic and more through atmosphere. It was in this softened environment that the idea of leaving together appeared, framed not as urgency, but as continuation of the night. Nothing in the moment felt unusual or alarming. It felt like a natural extension of what had already become an ordinary night in Milwaukee, within that space itself entirely now. The walk from the bar to Dahmer's apartment was quiet, filled with the ambient sounds of Milwaukee at night, distant traffic, occasional footsteps, and the soft hum of a city settling into its late hours. There was no sense of urgency, no visible tension, only the muted continuation of conversation that had begun earlier. The young man followed willingly, still interpreting the evening as social rather than dangerous. Dahmer remained composed, his behavior consistent with the persona he had carefully maintained throughout the night. Each block they passed felt ordinary, indistinguishable from any other route taken by countless residents before them. Streetlights cast uneven pools of yellow light across the pavement, briefly illuminating their figures before letting them fade back into shadow. In those moments, nothing appeared out of place. Everything seemed aligned with the normal flow of a city that never paused to question what moved through its streets. The apartment building stood like many others in Milwaukee, unremarkable in structure, and easily overlooked by anyone passing by. Inside, the hallway carried the faint scent of aging materials and the quiet echo of footsteps on worn flooring. Dahmer led the way without hesitation, his movements calm and familiar, as though returning from a routine outing rather than crossing into a private space that would soon define the limits of another person's life. The young man followed, still unaware of the significance of crossing that threshold. Doors closed behind them, muffling the outside world until it felt distant and disconnected. The lighting inside was dim, casting soft shadows along the walls and reducing clarity of detail. In that transition from public street to private interior, the atmosphere shifted subtly, though not in a way that immediately registered as danger. It was simply a change of environment, nothing more, only that. Inside the apartment, The atmosphere was quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence alone. Everyday objects were arranged with an almost careful neutrality, giving nothing away about what had happened there before, or what might happen next. The young man looked around with mild curiosity, still interpreting the space as simply another private interior, belonging to someone he had just met. Dahmer moved with a calmness that reinforced this perception, offering small gestures of hospitality that further reduced any remaining hesitation. The environment itself seemed to absorb sound, making conversations feel closer, more contained, as if the outside world had been sealed away completely. Time inside the apartment felt different, less linear and more suspended. What had been an ordinary evening outside now existed in a space where external reference points no longer mattered in the same way they had moments earlier, within that space itself entirely now. What began as social interaction outside now shifted into a quiet imbalance of control that neither voice explicitly named. Dahmer's presence felt more anchored within the space, while the young man's sense of familiarity began to dissolve into subtle uncertainty that he could not yet fully articulate. Small details that once seemed harmless now carried a different weight in the enclosed environment. The difference was not sudden but gradual, like a change in temperature that becomes noticeable only after time has passed. Dahmer remained composed, continuing to guide the flow of the moment without force or visible aggression, yet the structure of the interaction had changed. Within the apartment, external norms no longer provided the same grounding influence. What had been a shared evening in a public space was now an enclosed situation where perception itself began to shift under the pressure of isolation and control in silence now. This phase of the evening did not register immediately in the outside world, where life continued without interruption or awareness of what had just changed behind closed doors. To any observer on the street, nothing would have appeared unusual. The building remained still, the neighborhood unchanged, and the city carried on with its usual rhythm. Yet within that sealed environment, the absence of return had already begun, even if it was not yet understood as absence. Time passed without markers that could be measured from outside. For those who would later search for answers, this moment marked the beginning of uncertainty, the point at which communication ended and silence took its place. There was no signal, no indication, only the continuation of normal life outside, while something irreversible began inside a private space that no longer connected to the world beyond its walls, completely unnoticed in real time, still there. Across Milwaukee, the night continued to move forward with the same indifference it always carried, unaware of the quiet fracture that had formed within one apartment and one life intersecting another. Street lights flickered on empty sidewalks, cars passed through intersections, and distant conversations faded into the cold air. The city did not pause to interpret meaning in the small gaps between events, because it had no reason to believe those gaps contained anything significant. In that absence of awareness, the conditions that allowed hidden violence to persist remained intact. There was no warning embedded in the environment itself, no signal that could have guided attention toward what was unfolding out of sight. And so the night carried on, complete in its ordinary appearance, holding within it a reality that no one outside could yet see or understand in full, waiting for a moment that had not yet arrived. There still be by the time the night reached its most critical turning point in this case, nothing in Milwaukee's outward appearance suggested that the city was about to collide with something that would permanently alter its understanding of hidden crime. The streets remained steady, the buildings unchanged, and the flow of life continued in its usual quiet repetition. Yet inside one small apartment, a sequence of events had already begun to unravel in a way that would finally break the long silence that had surrounded Jeffrey Dahmer's private world. It started not with a discovery made by investigators, but with escape. A young man, later identified as one of Dahmer's intended victims, found himself in a situation that defied immediate comprehension. What had begun as a night shaped by social interaction and misplaced trust had shifted into something far more confined and threatening. Inside the apartment, The atmosphere had changed from ambiguity into clarity, and that clarity carried with it a realization that survival depended on action rather than hesitation. In moments like this, time behaves differently. Every second feels stretched, each movement weighted with consequence. The young man, despite fear and confusion, managed to create a narrow opportunity. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation in the way people later imagined when hearing about the case, but a desperate, instinct-driven break for survival. He ran. He left behind the enclosed space that had become a trap and moved back into the external world of hallways, doors, and finally the open air of Milwaukee streets. Once outside, the city did not immediately transform into something aware of what had just happened. Cars continued to pass. Lights from nearby buildings remained steady. But for him, the difference was absolute. The boundary between danger and safety had been crossed in reverse, and the urgency of that reversal carried him forward until he found help. He encountered law enforcement in a state of visible distress, disoriented, but insistent that something deeply wrong had occurred inside the apartment he had just escaped. At first, as is often the case in situations that sound too extreme to be immediately contextualized, there was a moment of uncertainty among officers. The story he presented was fragmented, shaped by panic and trauma, and it required confirmation before action could be taken at a larger scale. But there was something in his condition that could not be ignored. The physical signs of fear, the urgency in his voice, and the specificity of the location combined to create enough concern that officers decided to investigate further. This decision, made in real time and without knowledge of what would follow, would become one of the most significant turning points in the entire case. When police arrived at the apartment building, there was nothing externally that suggested what they were about to encounter. The structure itself was ordinary, consistent with many others in the neighborhood. There were no warning signs visible from the outside, no indication that behind one of its doors lay a reality that would soon overwhelm the expectations of everyone involved. They entered cautiously, still operating under the assumption that they were responding to a contained disturbance rather than something far more extensive. The interior of the building was quiet, the kind of silence that is common in residential spaces during late hours. As they approached the specific apartment, the sense of uncertainty remained. There was no immediate noise, no visible disruption, nothing that clearly aligned with the severity of the report they had received. Then the door opened. What greeted them inside was not a single moment of revelation, but a layered accumulation of signs that quickly removed any remaining ambiguity. The air itself carried a heavy, unsettling presence that immediately distinguished the interior from anything outside. Officers later described an instinctive recognition that something within that space was fundamentally wrong, even before full visual comprehension set in. As they moved further inside, the apartment revealed itself not as a normal living space, but as a contained environment shaped by repeated actions that had never been exposed to the outside world. Objects were present that did not belong in any ordinary domestic setting. The arrangement of the space suggested both neglect and deliberate concealment, as if daily life and hidden activity had been forced to coexist in the same confined structure. There were photographs discovered that would later become critical in understanding the scope of what had occurred. These images were not abstract evidence, but direct documentation of individuals whose absence had previously gone unexplained. For the officers in that moment, however, the meaning of these materials was not yet fully processed. It was the accumulation, the sheer volume of unsettling indicators, that began to build an understanding of scale. In different areas of the apartment, further evidence emerged that expanded the scope of the situation beyond anything initially anticipated. Containers, personal belongings, and other physical traces created a pattern that no longer suggested a single incident, but something sustained over time. Each discovery added another layer of realization, transforming the space from a residential unit into a scene of prolonged and repeated criminal activity. The psychological impact of this moment on the responding officers cannot be understated. Training prepares law enforcement for difficult scenes, but it does not fully prepare them for environments where the boundary between the expected and the unimaginable collapses in real time. What they encountered required immediate adjustment, not only in procedure, but in perception. The case was no longer about a single report of danger. It had expanded into something far more complex and deeply disturbing. As the search continued, it became clear that the apartment contained evidence linked to multiple missing persons cases that had not previously been connected in a formal investigative sense. What had once been treated as separate disappearances now appeared, within the confines of that space, to be part of a larger and coordinated pattern. The realization did not arrive all at once. It formed gradually as each new discovery reinforced the implications of the previous one. Communication between officers intensified as more personnel were called to the scene. The apartment was no longer treated as a standard crime response location, but as an active and significant investigation site requiring careful control and documentation. Every area had to be assessed, every item recorded, every detail preserved for later analysis. The scale of what was unfolding demanded immediate escalation. Meanwhile, outside the building, the neighborhood remained largely unaware of the internal transformation taking place just a few floors away. Residents continued their routines, some asleep, others awake, but detached from the activity occurring within their vicinity. This contrast between external normalcy and internal revelation created a stark divide, one that would later define public understanding of how such events can exist unnoticed in close proximity to everyday life. As more information became available, the identity of the apartment's resident began to take center stage. Jeffrey Dahmer, previously known only as a quiet and unremarkable presence in the building, was now associated with a rapidly expanding investigation that no longer fit within any simple category. The gap between his outward appearance and the emerging evidence inside his residence became one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire discovery. At this stage, he was not present in the apartment, which allowed investigators to proceed without immediate confrontation. His absence created space for uninterrupted examination of the environment he had constructed. That space, however, was filled with evidence that spoke for itself in ways that required no explanation in the moment. The structure of the investigation shifted from questioning a suspect to understanding the scope of what had already occurred. As the night progressed, the apartment transitioned from an unknown space into a central crime scene of extraordinary complexity. Every discovery reinforced the same conclusion: this was not an isolated incident, but a prolonged series of acts that had remained hidden within a single location. The implications of this realization extended far beyond the immediate investigation, reaching into multiple unresolved cases and unanswered questions across the city. By the time the full extent of the situation began to form in the minds of those present, Milwaukee itself remained unchanged outside. But within the walls of that apartment, a threshold had been crossed that could not be reversed. The silence that had protected the hidden world inside that space was gone, replaced by a reality that would soon extend far beyond a single building, drawing in law enforcement, families, and eventually the entire nation into its aftermath. After the initial discovery inside Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, the investigation did not immediately settle into clarity. Instead, it entered a phase defined by fragmentation, urgency, and confusion, where every new piece of evidence seemed to expand the scope of the case faster than it could be understood. What officers had walked into was not a single crime scene in the conventional sense, but a layered environment that suggested multiple timelines overlapping within the same physical space. And yet, even with the growing weight of what had been found, the full identity of the person responsible was still, at that moment, only partially understood. The first challenge investigators faced was not simply the volume of evidence, but its disorganization. The apartment did not present itself as a clean narrative of events. Instead, it revealed fragments that had to be interpreted under extreme time pressure. Photographs, personal items, and physical traces were present in ways that suggested a pattern, but not yet a fully mapped sequence. Each discovery raised new questions faster than answers could be confirmed. Officers rotated in and out of the space, some visibly struggling to maintain composure, as the scale of what they were seeing began to settle into understanding. At the same time, the question of who exactly lived there became central. Jeffrey Dahmer's identity, initially just a name attached to an address, now became the focal point of every line of inquiry. Background checks began almost immediately, revealing a history that seemed ordinary on the surface: employment records, previous residences, and interactions with law enforcement that had never escalated into anything that would have suggested the severity of what was now unfolding. He had, in many ways, lived beneath the threshold of suspicion, existing in the space between visibility and invisibility that urban environments often allow. Detectives quickly attempted to construct a behavioral timeline. Neighbors were interviewed in rapid succession, each providing small, disconnected observations. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He did not draw attention. These were the most consistent descriptions, repeated across multiple accounts. Some recalled unusual smells at times, or odd behavior that they had not known how to interpret in the moment, but nothing that had previously triggered formal intervention. The pattern that emerged from these interviews was not one of overt alarm, but of retrospective unease, where details only gained significance after the fact. As investigators attempted to stabilize the case, another layer of complexity emerged: the possibility of additional victims who had not yet been identified. Missing persons reports were pulled from various jurisdictions, and detectives began cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. What had initially been treated as separate, unrelated cases now began to form faint connections. These connections were not immediately definitive, but they were persistent enough to demand deeper examination. Each name represented a life, a timeline, and a set of unanswered questions that now converged within the scope of a single investigation. However, this process was far from straightforward. One of the major challenges was the inconsistency in reporting. Some individuals had been missing for extended periods without recent updates, while others had only recently been reported absent. In several cases, there had been delays in filing reports, often due to social circumstances, family distance, or uncertainty about whether disappearance was temporary. These gaps created obstacles in establishing a clear sequence of events. Investigators were forced to work backward from partial information, reconstructing possible intersections between Dahmer's known movements and the timelines of missing individuals. During this phase, law enforcement also had to contend with the limits of initial understanding. At first, there was no fully established framework for interpreting what had been found in the apartment. The evidence suggested repeated patterns of violence, but the scale was not yet fully quantified. As a result, early estimates varied significantly among investigators, with some believing the situation involved a smaller number of incidents, while others suspected a much larger scope. This uncertainty created tension within the investigative process, as decisions had to be made without complete information. Meanwhile, Dahmer himself was no longer present at the apartment, which shifted the focus of the investigation toward locating him. His absence introduced a new urgency, transforming the case from a static crime scene examination into an active search for a suspect, who now represented a significant public safety concern. Patrol units were alerted, and his known locations, including workplaces and previously associated addresses, were quickly reviewed. Despite this effort, there was no immediate indication of his whereabouts, which added pressure to an already rapidly expanding situation. In parallel, detectives began reviewing earlier police interactions that had involved Dahmer, but had not escalated at the time. One such instance involved a prior report where officers had been called to his residence, but did not fully recognize the seriousness of the situation they encountered. At that moment, the interaction had been resolved without further escalation, based on interpretations that, in hindsight, would later be heavily scrutinized. This retrospective review did not change the past, but it became an important part of understanding how warning signs had been missed or misinterpreted within procedural limits. As the investigation widened, attention also turned to individuals who had narrowly escaped harm in earlier encounters. These testimonies became critical in constructing a behavioral profile. Survivors described moments of confusion, disorientation, and narrowly avoided danger, often recounting experiences that they had struggled to fully explain at the time. When placed alongside physical evidence from the apartment, these accounts helped reinforce the understanding that the pattern of behavior had been ongoing and sustained over time, rather than isolated or spontaneous. Despite these developments, the emotional weight of the investigation was already becoming apparent among the officers and detectives involved. Working through the apartment required repeated exposure to evidence that challenged normal psychological boundaries. Rotations were implemented to manage exposure, but the impact of the environment could not be entirely mitigated. Many described the difficulty of maintaining focus while processing the implications of what they were uncovering. The case was no longer just an investigative challenge. It had become an emotional burden shared among those closest to it. Outside the immediate investigative team, communication with higher authorities began to escalate. Supervisors were briefed, and specialized units were brought in to assist with evidence processing and case management. The complexity of the scene required coordination across multiple departments, each responsible for different aspects of documentation, analysis, and containment. What had begun as a single emergency response had now expanded into a multi-layered investigation with regional implications. As night transitioned toward morning, the city of Milwaukee remained largely unaware of the full scope of what had occurred. News had not yet fully spread, and the details were still contained within law enforcement channels. This created a temporary divide between the internal reality of the investigation and the external perception of normalcy. Streets continued to fill with early commuters. Shops prepared for opening. Life moved forward without interruption, even as inside police briefings, a very different narrative was rapidly taking shape. By the end of this phase, the investigation had reached a critical point of convergence. Multiple strands of information were beginning to align: the evidence from the apartment, the missing persons reports, the survivor testimonies, and Domus' known history. Yet despite this convergence, many questions remained unanswered. The full extent of the crimes was still being determined. The suspect had not yet been located. And the process of transforming fragmented evidence into a coherent understanding of events was still underway. What defined this stage most clearly was uncertainty under pressure. Investigators were no longer asking whether something significant had occurred, but how large it truly was, how long it had been happening, and how many lives were connected to it. Each answer revealed another layer of complexity, and each new layer deepened the urgency of the search for clarity. In the silence between reports, interviews, and evidence logs, one fact had become increasingly unavoidable. The case was no longer about isolated incidents. It was about a sustained pattern that had existed unnoticed within the fabric of the city. And as investigators worked to connect the final pieces, the realization began to form that they were only at the beginning of understanding how far that pattern truly extended. The breakthrough in the case did not arrive as a sudden explosion of certainty, but as a narrowing corridor of doubt, where every uncertain fragment of the investigation began to point in one direction with increasing force. For the investigators working through Jeffrey Domus' apartment and the growing body of evidence connected to missing persons, the case had already reached a level of gravity that no one involved could ignore. Yet the most critical development would not come from forensic analysis or long deliberation. It would come from movement, panic, and the desperate instinct of survival from someone who had already been inside the center of the nightmare. Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer in the apartment when investigators began fully processing its contents. He had left the space shortly after the initial intrusion by police, and his departure created an immediate shift in the nature of the investigation. What had been a contained crime scene became a dual operation. One part focused on documenting and understanding the evidence inside the apartment, while the other shifted urgently toward locating a suspect, who was now clearly connected to multiple deaths and ongoing disappearances. The urgency was no longer theoretical. It was immediate and active. Detectives began reconstructing his likely movements, tracing his known routines, places he frequented, and areas where he might seek familiarity under pressure. Dahmer's life, previously unremarkable in its predictability, now became a map under scrutiny. Bars he visited regularly were contacted. His workplace was alerted. Officers were assigned to circulate through neighborhoods where he had previously lived or maintained contact. Yet despite these efforts, there was no immediate sign of him. It was as if he had dissolved into the city itself, blending back into the same anonymity that had allowed him to operate unnoticed for so long. But the breakthrough was already in motion elsewhere, in a place far removed from the structured environment of the investigation. It began with a man who had narrowly escaped from Dahmer's apartment, carrying with him not only physical distress, but the burden of something that defied easy explanation. He had already spoken to police once, providing the initial account that triggered the search of the apartment. Now, separated from that immediate moment of escape, he was still processing what he had seen and experienced. Memory, fear, and fragmented understanding were still colliding within him, forming a picture that was not yet complete, but was becoming impossible to ignore. While law enforcement processed the apartment, the survivor remained in a state of emotional and physical shock. But what made the situation critical was not just his condition. It was the realization that the man he had escaped from might still be active, still moving, still capable of finding others. That awareness created a second wave of urgency, this time not driven by investigators alone, but by the survivor's own understanding that silence was no longer an option. The danger had not ended when he left the apartment. It had only shifted. In a moment that would become one of the defining pivots of the entire case, he encountered Dahmer again. It was not planned. It was not anticipated. It was a chance intersection of movement in a city that, for all its size, can still compress individuals into shared physical space. Dahmer had been outside the apartment, attempting to maintain some form of normal motion through the city, though his internal state at that point was far from stable. He had already lost the controlled environment that had defined his actions. The structure he relied on had collapsed, and with it, his ability to maintain distance from consequence was rapidly dissolving. When the survivor recognized him, the recognition was immediate and visceral. There was no ambiguity, no hesitation of memory. The face, the presence, the association with the apartment all returned at once. What followed was instinct rather than planning. The survivor moved toward nearby authorities, calling attention, directing them toward the man he had just encountered. In that moment, the abstract investigation became concrete. The suspect was no longer an unknown figure moving somewhere in the city. He was present, visible, and within reach. Police response was immediate. Officers who had already been briefed on the severity of the case reacted quickly to the identification. Dahmer was approached and detained without resistance. At the moment of his arrest, there was no dramatic confrontation in the conventional sense. Instead, there was a quiet collapse of the boundary that had separated his private actions from public consequence. The man who had operated for years within the unseen spaces of Milwaukee was now fully exposed to the system that had been unknowingly circling around him. Inside Dahmer's immediate state, there was no visible attempt at escape, or denial in the way some might expect from someone in his position. His demeanor was subdued, almost detached, as if the transition from hidden life to public exposure had already been anticipated internally, even if not consciously acknowledged. But for investigators, this moment marked the first point where control over the narrative began to shift entirely toward law enforcement. Once in custody, Dahmer was transported for questioning, and the focus of the investigation expanded beyond the apartment itself. What had been discovered there was already overwhelming, but now it required confirmation, explanation, and contextualization. Detectives began structured interrogation, carefully piecing together timelines, identities, and sequences of events. At first, responses were limited, fragmented, and cautious. But as questioning continued, a broader pattern began to emerge through his own admissions. What investigators were confronting was not a single act, but a prolonged series of events that extended over years. The scale of what Dahmer described in subsequent statements forced a re-evaluation of earlier assumptions. The number of victims, previously uncertain, began to solidify into a far larger total than initially expected. Each revelation added depth to an already overwhelming case file, transforming it from a localized investigation into one of national significance. At the same time, forensic teams continued processing the apartment with extreme care. Every new piece of evidence reinforced the same conclusion, but also introduced new complexities. Identification of victims became a priority, requiring coordination with missing persons databases, dental records, and family reports from multiple jurisdictions. The process was slow, meticulous, and emotionally taxing for those involved, as each identification represented not just data, but a life and a family waiting for answers. Outside the investigative environment, news of the arrest began to spread. What had been a contained police operation now transitioned into public awareness. The name Jeffrey Dahmer, previously unknown to most, rapidly became associated with a growing understanding of the scale of the crimes involved. For the city of Milwaukee, the realization was gradual but unavoidable. A sense of disbelief began to take hold, as residents struggled to reconcile the image of an ordinary neighbor with the unfolding details of his actions. For investigators, however, there was no pause for public reaction. The priority remained documentation, confirmation, and preservation of evidence. The breakthrough, while decisive in terms of arrest, did not conclude the investigation. Instead, it opened a new phase, one defined by reconstruction. Every detail now had to be placed within a coherent framework that could withstand legal scrutiny and provide clarity to the families affected. As interrogation continued, the psychological dimension of the case became increasingly central. Dahmer's explanations, while providing factual detail, also revealed a deeply distorted internal logic that investigators and psychologists would later analyze extensively. His descriptions of control, isolation, and possession were not presented in emotional terms, but in a detached manner that made them even more unsettling to those listening. The absence of emotional framing created a distance that was difficult to reconcile with the severity of the acts being described. By the end of this phase, the investigation had reached a turning point that could not be reversed. The suspect was in custody. The primary location of the crimes had been secured. And the scope of the case, while still expanding, was now anchored in verified evidence and direct admission. Yet even with this breakthrough, the full understanding of what had occurred was still incomplete. Investigators had crossed the threshold from discovery into confirmation, but the process of fully comprehending the extent of the case was only beginning. Milwaukee, still unaware in its broader population of the full depth of what had occurred, continued its daily rhythm. But within the investigative teams, there was a shared recognition that something unprecedented had been uncovered. The breakthrough had not resolved the story. It had revealed its true scale, and in doing so, opened a path that would lead far deeper into one of the most disturbing cases in modern criminal history, the the courtroom where Jeffrey Dahmer would face justice was never just a physical space. It became a stage where the unimaginable was translated into legal language, where fragments of horror were reconstructed into testimony, and where the abstract idea of evil was forced into the structured rhythm of law. For the public, it was a place of answers. For the families of victims, it was a place where silence finally had to speak. And for those directly involved in the trial, it was an environment where emotional weight and procedural discipline collided in ways that were difficult to contain. From the moment Dahmer was brought into formal proceedings, the atmosphere surrounding the case shifted from investigative urgency to judicial gravity. The arrest had already confirmed the reality of his actions, but the courtroom would determine how that reality was defined, recorded, and ultimately judged. The legal system now became responsible not only for punishment, but for translating a deeply disturbing series of events into something that could be comprehended within the boundaries of law. Jeffrey Dahmer appeared in court with a demeanor that stood in stark contrast to the emotional intensity surrounding him. His physical presence was subdued, his expressions controlled, and his responses often minimal. This lack of outward reaction became one of the most unsettling aspects of the proceedings. While families and prosecutors spoke in detail about loss, violence, and absence, Dahmer remained largely detached, as if observing the process from a distance rather than participating in it as the central figure. The prosecution built its case on a foundation of overwhelming physical evidence and detailed reconstruction of events. The contents of his apartment, forensic findings, and documented connections to missing persons formed a framework that left little room for ambiguity regarding responsibility. Each piece of evidence added weight to a narrative that was no longer speculative, but confirmed through multiple independent sources. The courtroom became a space where evidence did not merely support argument, but defined it entirely. Family members of victims were given the opportunity to speak, and their testimonies introduced a dimension of human consequence that no forensic report could fully capture. Their words described not only the absence of loved ones, but the ongoing emotional disruption caused by uncertainty, unanswered questions, and the sudden disappearance of people who had once been central to their lives. These statements transformed the courtroom from a technical legal environment into a space of shared grief, where individual stories of loss were given public voice for the first time. As these testimonies were delivered, the contrast between emotional expression and Dahmer's stillness became increasingly pronounced. The courtroom contained two parallel realities. One was filled with memory, pain, and the attempt to find meaning in loss. The other remained emotionally distant, constrained by silence and minimal reaction. This divergence created an atmosphere that many present later described as difficult to process, as if two incompatible versions of reality were occupying the same physical space. The defense, while limited by the strength of the evidence, focused on Dahmer's mental state. Arguments centered on psychological disturbance, early developmental issues, and patterns of behavior that suggested long-term detachment from normal social and emotional structures. These arguments did not seek to deny the events themselves, which were already firmly established, but rather to provide context for understanding how such actions could have developed over time. The question of responsibility was not removed, but reframed within the boundaries of mental health and legal accountability. Expert testimony played a significant role in shaping the court's understanding of Dahmer's psychological profile. Specialists described patterns of behavior consistent with severe disorders of impulse control, empathy disruption, and distorted perception of human relationships. These analyses did not simplify the case, but instead deepened its complexity, revealing that the actions under examination were not only criminal in nature, but also rooted in profound psychological dysfunction. However, even within these explanations, there was no reduction in the gravity of the consequences. Throughout the proceedings, Dahmer ultimately chose to speak directly to the court. His statements were measured and unemotional in tone, acknowledging responsibility for the actions attributed to him. There was no attempt to shift blame or deny involvement. Instead, his words reflected an acceptance of legal guilt within the framework presented by the prosecution. This admission did not resolve the emotional impact of the case, but it provided a formal conclusion to the question of accountability within the courtroom itself. The sentencing phase carried its own emotional weight. The court was tasked not only with determining legal punishment, but with responding to a case that had affected multiple families across different communities. The judge's role required balancing legal standards with the extraordinary nature of the crimes presented. When the sentence was delivered, it reflected the maximum extent of legal consequence available under the law, multiple life sentences, without the possibility of release. For those present, the sentence did not function as closure in an emotional sense. Instead, it represented a legal endpoint, a formal acknowledgement that the judicial system had reached its final determination. Outside the courtroom, reactions varied widely. For some, the sentencing brought a measure of structure to an otherwise incomprehensible series of events. For others, it did not diminish the absence left behind by those who were no longer present. Media coverage of the trial expanded rapidly, transforming the case into a national and international point of focus. The details of the investigation, the contents of the apartment, and the courtroom proceedings were analyzed and discussed across multiple platforms. Public reaction ranged from shock to disbelief, with many struggling to reconcile the ordinary appearance of Domus' life with the scale of his actions. The case became not only a legal matter, but also a cultural reference point for discussions about criminal behavior, missed warning signs, and systemic limitations in early intervention. Within Milwaukee, the trial left a lasting imprint on the community. Residents, who had previously lived in proximity to Dahmer, began re-evaluating past interactions and experiences in light of what had been revealed. Ordinary memories, once considered insignificant, were now reinterpreted through the lens of knowledge they did not previously possess. This retrospective awareness created a collective sense of unease, where familiarity with the past was permanently altered by understanding gained only after the fact. For law enforcement and investigative agencies, the case prompted internal reflection on procedural gaps and missed opportunities. The timeline of Dahmer's activity, when reviewed in full, revealed points where earlier intervention might have been possible if certain reports had been treated differently, or if specific details had been connected sooner. These realizations did not change the outcome of the case, but they influenced future approaches to similar situations, particularly in how missing persons reports and suspicious behavior were evaluated. As the courtroom phase concluded, the legal system had completed its primary function, establishing guilt, assigning responsibility, and issuing sentence. But the broader implications of the case extended far beyond these formal outcomes. The courtroom had provided structure to the events, but it could not fully contain their emotional or psychological impact. That weight remained distributed across families, communities, and institutions long after the final gavel fell. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial ended with legal finality, but the questions it raised continued to circulate far beyond the courtroom walls. Questions about visibility, about recognition of warning signs, and about how ordinary environments can contain extraordinary violence without immediate detection. These questions would persist long after the legal process concluded, shaping discussions in criminology, psychology, and public awareness for years to come. After the courtroom had fallen silent and the formal language of sentencing had been spoken, what remained in Milwaukee was not closure in the emotional sense, but a long, uneven process of reckoning. The trial had ended the legal chapter of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes, but it had not ended the questions that continued to circulate through families, investigators, psychologists, and the wider public. In many ways, the aftermath began where the courtroom ended, in the space where official answers no longer felt sufficient to contain what had been revealed. For the families of the victims, time did not move forward in a clean line after the verdict. The sentencing did not restore what had been taken, nor did it resolve the emotional fragmentation that had accumulated over years of uncertainty, fear, and eventual confirmation of loss. Instead, it marked the beginning of a different kind of struggle, one defined by memory rather than mystery. For many, the hardest part was no longer not knowing what had happened, but knowing in painful detail what had. Grief in this context was not a single moment of emotional release. It was an ongoing process that shifted in intensity without warning. Some families experienced a sense of relief that the search for answers had ended, even if the answers themselves were devastating. Others found that the confirmation of events reopened emotional wounds that had been partially managed during the period of uncertainty. The human mind, when forced to reconcile absence without explanation, often creates a form of suspended hope. When that hope is finally removed, the emotional impact can be destabilizing in ways that are difficult to predict or contain. In Milwaukee itself, the atmosphere changed in subtle but lasting ways. The city did not transform overnight, but there was a noticeable shift in how people perceived their surroundings. Buildings that had once been ordinary now carried associations that could not be easily separated from what had occurred inside them. Streets that had once been simply part of daily routes became embedded with retrospective awareness. Even spaces that had no direct connection to the events began to feel altered by proximity alone. This phenomenon extended beyond physical locations. Social trust, particularly in casual encounters, experienced a quiet recalibration. People became more cautious in situations that had previously felt routine. Conversations about safety and awareness entered public discourse more frequently, not as abstract concerns, but as responses shaped by a case that had revealed how deeply hidden behavior could exist within familiar environments. The idea that someone could maintain an ordinary exterior while conducting extraordinary acts of violence forced a collective reassessment of assumptions that had once gone unquestioned. Within law enforcement and investigative agencies, the aftermath of the Dahmer case prompted sustained internal reflection. Reviews of procedural history revealed points where earlier intervention might have altered the trajectory of events. These were not simple failures of a single moment, but a series of missed connections distributed across time. Reports that were not fully pursued, warnings that were not escalated, and fragmented pieces of information that were not yet recognized as part of a larger pattern all contributed to a retrospective understanding that the system had encountered signals it did not yet have the framework to interpret correctly. This realization did not lead to immediate systemic transformation, but it did influence gradual changes in how certain types of cases were approached. Missing persons investigations, in particular, began to receive more integrated analysis across jurisdictions. The importance of connecting seemingly unrelated reports gained greater emphasis. The Dahmer case became a reference point in training and procedural discussions, not because it was unique in its existence, but because of how long it remained undetected despite multiple points of potential intervention. Psychologically, the case also became a subject of intense study. Experts sought to understand not only the behavior of Jeffrey Dahmer, but the conditions that allowed such behavior to remain hidden within a densely populated urban environment. His psychological profile was analyzed in detail, focusing on patterns of detachment, control, and internalized fantasy that existed alongside outward normalcy. What made the case particularly complex was not simply the presence of violent behavior, but the sustained ability to maintain a functional exterior life that did not trigger consistent suspicion. However, even with extensive analysis, there was no singular explanation that could fully account for every dimension of the case. Instead, what emerged was a layered understanding that combined individual psychology, social environment, and systemic limitations. Dahmer's actions were not isolated from context, but neither were they reducible to any single cause. This complexity resisted simple interpretation, which is part of why the case continues to be studied decades later. Inside the prison system, Dahmer's life took a different trajectory. Removed from the environment in which his crimes had occurred, he entered a structured institutional setting where his identity was fully defined by conviction and sentence. For a period, he existed under conditions of constant supervision, separated from the public world that had once unknowingly contained him. Even within this environment, however, his presence remained controversial and highly sensitive due to the nature of his crimes. In 1994, that chapter came to a sudden and violent end when Dahmer was killed by a fellow inmate. His death closed the physical timeline of his life, but it did not resolve the broader impact of his actions. In many ways, the end of his life shifted focus even further away from him as an individual, and toward the larger systems and questions his case had exposed. His death did not undo the need for understanding, nor did it diminish the lasting effects on those directly and indirectly affected. As years passed, the Dahmer case continued to occupy a persistent place in public consciousness. It became more than a criminal case file. It became a reference point in discussions about criminal psychology, investigative procedure, and the limits of perception in identifying hidden danger. Documentaries, academic studies, and cultural interpretations revisited the case repeatedly, each attempting in different ways to process what had happened and why it had remained undetected for so long. For Milwaukee, the legacy of the case remained complex. It was not a defining identity for the city, but it was an undeniable part of its history. Residents who lived through the period often described a sense of temporal division, a before and after that could not be reconciled into a single narrative. Ordinary life continued, new generations grew up, and the city evolved in countless other ways, yet the memory of what had occurred persisted as a quiet undercurrent in its collective awareness. One of the most enduring aspects of the aftermath was the way it reshaped conversations about visibility. Dahmer's ability to operate without detection for an extended period challenged assumptions about how danger is recognized in everyday life. It forced a reconsideration of how much weight is placed on external appearance, routine behavior, and perceived normality. The case demonstrated that these indicators, while useful in most circumstances, are not absolute guarantees of internal reality. In academic and psychological fields, the case also contributed to ongoing discussions about empathy, social isolation, and the development of antisocial behavior. Researchers examined early life factors, environmental influences, and behavioral patterns in an attempt to understand how such extreme detachment from human life could develop and persist. While no single model could fully explain the entirety of Dahmer's actions, the case became a reference point for exploring the intersection of individual pathology and systemic oversight. Perhaps most significantly, the aftermath of the case underscored the limits of retrospective understanding. Looking back, patterns can appear clearer, connections more obvious, and missed opportunities more visible. But at the time they occurred, those same elements existed within uncertainty, fragmented information, and incomplete perception. This gap between hindsight and real-time awareness became one of the most important lessons drawn from the case, both within law enforcement and in broader societal reflection. In the end, the aftermath of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes is not defined by a single conclusion, but by a continuing process of interpretation. The legal system reached its endpoint, the perpetrator's life ended in prison, and the immediate investigation concluded. Yet the questions raised by the case continue to exist in different forms, shaped by each new generation that encounters its history. What remains is not only the memory of what happened, but the ongoing effort to understand how it was able to happen within a world that, on the surface, appeared completely ordinary. In the years following the formal conclusion of Jeffrey Dahmer's trial and the immediate aftermath of his incarceration, the case did not fade into history in the way many criminal cases eventually do. Instead, it began to evolve into something more complex, shifting from a legal matter into a long-term subject of public memory, academic analysis, and cultural interpretation. What had once been a rapidly unfolding investigation became a lasting reference point, revisited repeatedly as new generations tried to understand not only what happened, but how it was allowed to happen within an ordinary urban environment. One of the most persistent aspects of the case in this later phase was the way it forced a re-evaluation of assumptions about normality. Before the revelations inside Doma's apartment, there had been nothing in his outward appearance that suggested the scale of his internal reality. He lived in a modest building, maintained basic routines, and interacted minimally, but not conspicuously, with those around him. This disconnect between external perception and internal behavior became one of the central themes in how the case was later studied and discussed. In academic circles, particularly in psychology and criminology, Doma's case became a focal point for examining the boundaries of antisocial behavior and the development of extreme psychological detachment. Researchers analyzed his early life, searching for patterns that might indicate the gradual formation of his later actions. Childhood isolation, emotional withdrawal, and early fascination with death were all examined as potential contributing factors, but none of these elements alone provided a complete explanation. Instead, the case highlighted how complex and multilayered human behavior can be, especially when it develops outside of consistent social correction or intervention. Another major area of study involved the systems that failed to identify the pattern of his actions earlier. Law enforcement agencies reviewed the timeline of reports, missing persons cases, and prior interactions with Doma that had not escalated into full investigation. These reviews did not focus on assigning individual blame so much as understanding structural limitations. At the time, information was often fragmented across jurisdictions, communication between departments was slower, and missing persons cases were not always treated with equal urgency depending on context. In Doma's case, these limitations created gaps that were only visible in hindsight. The case also influenced how missing persons investigations were approached in later years. One of the most significant procedural changes that emerged gradually was the emphasis on cross-referencing seemingly unrelated reports more systematically. Before this shift, it was not uncommon for cases to be treated as isolated events unless a clear connection was immediately visible. After Doma's crimes were fully understood, there was increased awareness that patterns could exist even when they were not immediately obvious. This did not eliminate failures in future investigations, but it did contribute to a more cautious and interconnected approach in many jurisdictions. Public perception of safety also shifted in subtle but lasting ways. The idea that danger could exist within familiar environments without visible warning signs became a widely discussed concept. People began to reassess how trust is formed in everyday interactions, particularly in situations involving strangers in social settings. Bars, nightlife districts, and transient social environments were often referenced in discussions about vulnerability, not because they were inherently dangerous, but because they represented spaces where brief human connections could form without long-term context. This shift in perception was not uniform or absolute. Most people continued their daily lives without significant change, and urban environments remained fundamentally the same in structure and function. However, the awareness introduced by cases like Doma's created a kind of background caution in public consciousness. It was not always explicit, but it influenced how people interpreted unfamiliar interactions and how quickly trust was extended in certain situations. In media and cultural representation, the case took on a life of its own. Documentaries, books, and later dramatizations revisited the events repeatedly, each attempting to construct a coherent narrative from a series of fragmented and disturbing realities. Some focused on the psychological profile of Doma himself, while others emphasized the victims and the systemic failures that allowed the crimes to continue for so long. This diversity of interpretation reflected the complexity of the case and the difficulty of reducing it to a single explanatory framework. However, this cultural attention also raised ethical questions about representation. As the case became widely known, there was ongoing debate about how such stories should be told, particularly in relation to the dignity of victims and the risk of turning real suffering into public spectacle. Families of victims often had to navigate the tension between public interest and personal grief, as renewed attention to the case would sometimes reopen emotional wounds that had never fully healed. Within Milwaukee, the long-term impact of the case was more localized but equally significant. Certain locations associated with the investigation became permanently linked to the events in public memory. Even years later, people would reference these places in relation to what had occurred there, creating a lasting association that could not easily be separated from the city's broader identity. At the same time, Milwaukee continued to grow and change, with new developments, new communities, and new generations who did not directly experience the events, but inherited their historical weight. One of the more difficult aspects of the long-term reflection on the case is the question of missed opportunities. In hindsight, the timeline reveals moments where different decisions might have led to earlier intervention. However, these moments existed within the constraints of incomplete information and procedural limitations. At the time, no single piece of data clearly revealed the full scope of what was occurring. It was only when many fragments were later combined that the pattern became visible. This distinction between clarity in hindsight and ambiguity in real time remains one of the most important lessons drawn from the case. Jeffrey Dahmer's later life in prison, and his eventual death at the hands of another inmate, added another layer to the public narrative, but did not resolve the broader questions his case raised. His death marked the end of his personal timeline, but not the end of the discussions surrounding his actions. In many ways, the focus had already shifted away from him as an individual and toward the broader implications of how such behavior develops, how it goes undetected, and how systems respond when it is finally uncovered. Over time, the case became less about a single person and more about a convergence of factors: psychological complexity, social isolation, institutional limitations, and the unpredictability of human behavior. It served as a reference point not because it was easily understood, but because it resisted simple explanation. That resistance is part of what keeps it present in ongoing discussions decades later. Even now, the Dahmer case continues to be studied, referenced, and analyzed in different contexts. Each retelling adds another layer of interpretation, but none fully exhausts its complexity. It remains a case defined not only by what happened, but by the enduring difficulty of fully comprehending how it unfolded within a world that, on the surface, appeared entirely ordinary. In the extended shadow of the Jeffrey Dahmer case, long after the courtroom verdicts had been delivered and the immediate wave of investigation had subsided, a different kind of process began to take shape. It was slower, less visible, and in many ways more complex than the criminal proceedings themselves. This was the process of long-term understanding, where facts that had once been urgently gathered under pressure were now being examined with distance, reflection, and the uncomfortable clarity that only time can provide. What made the Dahmer case endure in public consciousness was not only the scale of what had occurred, but the unsettling proximity of it to ordinary life. This was not a story that unfolded in an isolated or remote environment. It happened in a functioning city, within residential buildings, near workplaces, bars, and streets that thousands of people used every day. That proximity forced a confrontation with a difficult idea: that extreme violence can exist within environments that otherwise appear entirely normal. As years passed, the case became a reference point in discussions far beyond criminal law. In psychology, it was revisited repeatedly as an example of severe personality disturbance combined with prolonged behavioral concealment. Researchers were particularly interested in how Dahmer's internal world developed alongside an outward life that did not immediately trigger intervention. The central question was not simply what he did, but how his actions remained undetected for so long in a densely populated environment. One of the recurring themes in psychological analysis was the structure of isolation. Dahmer did not exist in complete social absence. He had contact with others, however limited, and he operated within systems that should, in theory, have created some level of behavioral feedback. Yet his interactions were often superficial, transactional, or brief enough that they did not form a stable pattern of recognition among those around him. This partial visibility created a condition where he was known, but not understood, present, but not fully perceived. Another focus of study was the relationship between internal fantasy and external behavior. Analysts examined how Dahmer described his motivations after his arrest, particularly his emphasis on control, possession, and an attempt to create permanence in relationships that were inherently temporary. While these explanations did not excuse or normalize his actions, they provided insight into the psychological distortion that shaped his decisions. The most disturbing aspect for many researchers was not only the content of these motivations, but their consistency over time, suggesting a deeply embedded internal framework rather than a sudden breakdown. In criminology, the case became a foundational study in the limits of detection. Investigators and academics analyzed the sequence of missed opportunities, not as isolated failures, but as part of a broader structural pattern. One of the key lessons identified was the fragmentation of information across systems. Different jurisdictions held pieces of data that, when viewed separately, did not appear connected. Missing persons reports, minor police encounters, and witness accounts existed in parallel rather than in integration. It was only after the fact that these fragments formed a coherent picture. This realization led to gradual shifts in investigative methodology. Over time, law enforcement agencies placed greater emphasis on cross-referencing data across regions and departments. The idea that seemingly unrelated cases could share underlying connections became more widely accepted. While no system can eliminate the risk of oversight entirely, the Dahmer case contributed to a cultural and procedural awareness that absence of immediate pattern does not necessarily mean absence of structure. Beyond institutional analysis, the case also had a profound effect on public perception of trust and familiarity. One of the most unsettling aspects for many people was the realization that Dahmer did not rely on secrecy in the traditional sense. He did not operate in completely hidden spaces removed from social contact. Instead, he functioned within everyday environments, interacting just enough to maintain normalcy while concealing the full extent of his private actions. This challenged common assumptions about how danger is recognized in daily life. As a result, discussions about safety began to incorporate a more nuanced understanding of visibility. People became more aware of the limits of surface-level perception. The idea that someone could appear ordinary while maintaining a completely separate internal reality became a reference point in conversations about caution, awareness, and social judgment. This did not lead to universal suspicion or withdrawal from social interaction, but it did introduce a layer of reflective distance in certain contexts. In cultural representation, the Dahmer case became increasingly prominent over time. It was revisited in documentaries, written analyses, dramatizations, and academic publications. Each retelling emphasized different aspects of the story. Some focused on the victims and their lives before the crimes, attempting to restore individuality to those who had been reduced to case numbers in early reporting. Others concentrated on the investigative process, highlighting both its successes and its limitations. Still others examined Dahmer himself as a psychological subject, attempting to map the internal structure of his behavior. However, this growing body of representation also raised ongoing ethical questions. As the case became more widely known, the line between education, analysis, and consumption of true crime content became increasingly debated. Families of victims in particular were often placed in a difficult position, as renewed public attention could bring back emotional distress even decades after the events. The tension between public interest and private grief remained unresolved, and in many ways continues to exist in discussions of similar cases today. Another important dimension of long-term reflection involved the role of hindsight. When reviewing the timeline of Dahmer's activities, it becomes possible to identify moments where intervention might have occurred earlier. Certain police encounters, witness reports, and behavioral indicators appear more significant when viewed retrospectively. However, what makes this realization complex is that each of those moments existed within its own immediate context, without the benefit of future knowledge. Decisions made at the time were based on limited information, procedural standards, and interpretation of available evidence. This distinction between what is visible in hindsight and what is knowable in real time is one of the most important lessons derived from the case. It highlights the inherent difficulty in identifying hidden patterns without sufficient accumulation of evidence. It also underscores the challenge faced by systems that must make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, where incomplete information is the norm rather than the exception. In Milwaukee, the long-term impact of the case remained present in subtle ways. While the city continued to grow, evolve, and change in countless positive directions, the memory of what had occurred persisted as part of its historical landscape. Certain locations associated with the investigation carried an enduring association in public awareness. This does not mean that the city became defined by the case, but rather that the case became one of many layers in its collective history. For residents who lived through the period, the memory often exists as a form of temporal separation. Life before the public revelation of the crimes and life after it feel distinct, even though the physical environment remained largely unchanged. This division is not unique to Milwaukee, but the scale and visibility of the Dahmer case made it particularly pronounced in this context. Over time, the case also influenced broader discussions about mental health, social isolation, and early intervention. While it is important to avoid oversimplifying the relationship between psychological factors and criminal behavior, the case did encourage greater attention to signs of severe detachment and behavioral disturbance. In some contexts, it contributed to improved awareness of when to escalate concerns or seek further evaluation. At the same time, experts have emphasized that no single case can serve as a universal template. Dahmer's behavior was shaped by a combination of factors that are not easily replicated or generalized. This caution is important in preventing overly simplistic conclusions about complex human behavior. The case illustrates extremes, but it does not provide a complete model for prediction or prevention. As the decades continue to pass, the Dahmer case remains present not as a static story, but as an evolving reference point. Each generation that encounters it brings new perspectives, shaped by changes in psychology, law enforcement, media, and cultural understanding. What remains consistent is the difficulty of fully comprehending how such events can unfold within ordinary environments without immediate detection. In the end, the long-term significance of the Jeffrey Dahmer case lies not only in what happened, but in what it continues to reveal about perception, limitation, and understanding. It forces a confrontation with the fact that reality is often more fragmented than it appears, and that the most disturbing patterns are not always visible when they are forming. Instead, they are often recognized only after they have already taken shape, leaving behind questions that continue to resonate long after the events themselves have ended.